When I was younger, I was in the Boy Scouts and I went on multiple camping trips per year. There was one particular camping trip that will forever be burned into my memory because, well, it involved a fire. So there I was. We had just gotten finished with dinner and we were getting ready for our evening campfire. Our scout leaders, after they had already got the fire started, stepped into the woods to get some more wood. Now, we were in the woods, which contains a lot of wood, so they didn't have to go far. One of my fellow scouts had a major propensity for getting into trouble, and he needed to be watched closely at all times. Well, the scout leader who was designated to be the one to watch him closely just so happened to be the same one who was in the woods getting more wood for the campfire. A few seconds after they disappeared, they screamed at the top of their lungs, "Run and duck!" Now, we didn't know why or to where we were running, but we heard the fear and the intensity in their voices, so we obeyed. Later, after the explosion, yes, I said explosion, we would find out what happened. Remember that scout who was supposed to be watched at all times, but who also was not being watched at that particular time? Well, he capitalized on his few seconds of freedom, and he found an aerosol can and threw it into the fire. Aerosol cans and fire usually are not a good combination. When we heard our scout leader scream, we grabbed the closest person to us and we started running, and we dove for cover behind anything that we could find. However, there was nothing there to hide behind except for tents. Canvas tents. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but canvas doesn't stand a chance at stopping shrapnel from an exploding aerosol can. But we had no time to think about that. No one got hurt, thankfully. The tents became holy, but we were safe. Speaking of holy tents, there's a story in the Old Testament about a group of people desperately needing God to guide them, to be with them, and to keep them safe. It is the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage and to the Promised Land by way of the wilderness. Now, we will see that God called the Israelites to something, that he did not expect them to do it alone, and that his presence went with them, guiding them and keeping them safe. Perhaps you can think of a situation from your life, or maybe it's something through which you are currently traversing. In your situation, whatever it may be, you needed God to be with you, to guide you, and to keep you safe. You knew that you could not do it alone, and you needed his strength to get you through it. Perhaps that difficult time was the death of a loved one. In your time of sadness and grief and pain, you needed to know that God was going to be with you. Perhaps that difficult time was the loss of a job, or finding out that you didn't get that promotion that you were promised and for which you had worked so incredibly hard. In your time of frustration, in your time of uncertainty, and in your time of probably even anger, you needed to know that God was going to be with you. Perhaps that difficult time is because of your anger and frustration with the United Methodist Church and their decision on homosexuality in regard to ordination and marriage. Some of you may be in favor of that decision, while others of you may not be in favor of it. Wherever you fall on the spectrum, whether you support it or whether you're against it, you want to know that God is present, that he's involved in this matter and in his church, and that he's working in the lives of his people. Or perhaps that difficult time is because of the stress and the anxiety and the burnout that you are currently facing due to the pressures of being overworked and overscheduled. In your time of being drained, you want to know that God is going to be with you. When we are camping in the situations of life, God's presence is with us and we are not alone. The Israelites had their own concerns, and they experienced God showing up in major ways in their life. They needed God's presence to be a protection, to be a guide, and to be a blessing for them, just like we do today. Today, we are going to gain some insights from a man who was the leader of God's people, a man who boldly questioned God and demanded something from him. And as a result, he was blessed because of it. The character we'll be focusing on today is one of the most prominent figures in the Old Testament. It's Moses. Moses had an encounter with God in what I like to call a burning bush experience, where God spoke to him through a bush that was on fire but did not burn up. Now, in this unusual encounter, God specifically chose Moses to lead the Israelites, God's chosen people, from captivity in Egypt to freedom, blessing, and salvation in the Promised Land. During Moses' burning bush experience, where God called him to be his chosen vessel for this monumental task, Moses tried to weasel his way out of it, out of what God was calling him to do. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Then God assured Moses that he would be with him. After this, Moses proceeded to go back and forth with God in an attempt to get him to send someone else, anyone else. Finally, God had had enough of Moses' shenanigans, and his anger burned against him, which is kind of ironic because, considering the context, God was already speaking to him in the form of a burning bush. But God granted Moses' request and designated Aaron, Moses' brother, to go with him. Moses' burning bush experience was the first turning point of his spiritual life. It was his first real encounter with the very real presence of God. Now, I take comfort in this story because God, the creator of the entire universe, allowed Moses to question him, as if he knew better than God did. And this tells us that we too can question God. It's okay. God is going to be able to handle our questions because he is a big God. When we are camping in the situations of life, God's presence will be with us and we are not alone. Fast forward many years to after Moses and Aaron, with God's help, had succeeded in liberating the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. And you'll find the Israelites engaging in idol worship because they got tired of waiting for Moses to come back down from the mountain where he was speaking with God. The next day, in an attempt to seek forgiveness for his people, Moses went back up to speak with the Lord. He set up a tent outside of the Israelite camp, and he called it the Tent of Meeting. Every time Moses would enter this tent, a pillar of cloud, which was God's presence, would come down and remain at the tent's entrance and speak with Moses. When God would speak to Moses, he would do it as a man speaks with a friend. This particular time when Moses was speaking with God, he was a little frustrated and he questioned God. He said, "Look, you have told me to lead this people, and I have done that, but you have not yet told me whom you will send with me. You also told me that you know me by name and that you have found favor with me." And finally, Moses reminds God that the Israelites were his chosen people. To this, God replied that his presence would go with them and that he would give them rest. But apparently this wasn't enough for Moses because he still remembered a previous conversation where God had told him that he would not go with them because the Israelites were a stiff-necked people. Now Moses was wondering, which one was it going to be? Would God go with them or would he not? Now, if the answer was that God was not going with them, then Moses and his people weren't going either. Moses then said to God, "How will it be known that I and your people have found favor with you unless you go with us?" Now, we tend to think that Moses probably shouldn't have doubted God and that he should have remembered how God had been faithful in his life in the past. He should have remembered his protection on the river when Pharaoh's daughter found him floating in the basket and rescued him. He should have remembered God's calling on his life and his guidance in his burning bush experience. He should have remembered how God provided safety and clear passage in the parting of the Red Sea. He should have known that if God was with him in every other area of his life, then he would be with him as he led the Israelites into the Promised Land. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. And here Moses was, still doubting and still questioning him. Then God replied, "I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor with me, and you know me by name." Now there was again, God reminded Moses that he knew him by name. And And God says the same thing to us today. Oh, how we need to hear that. What I have found in my walk with God is that he always seems to know just what we need and exactly when we need it. When we are camping in the situations of life, God's presence is with us and we are not alone. But this wasn't enough for Moses, so he demanded that God show him his glory. To this demand, God surprisingly agreed and said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. But there was one caveat. God said that Moses could not see his face because humans cannot see God and live. Now you might be thinking, wait, wasn't Moses already talking to God face to face when he told him that he couldn't see his face? The answer to that is no. He was speaking to God in the form of the pillar of fire, in the same way that he was speaking to God in the form of a burning bush in his past. To protect Moses when God allowed his glory to pass in front of him, God provided a crevice of a rock which Moses was to stand in while God covered him with his hand. Once God passed by, he took his hand away, and Moses saw God's back. Now, no one had ever seen God in all of his glory. Even the angels in heaven cover their eyes as they worship God. But here Moses was, standing in the cleft of this rock, provided by God, seeing and experiencing God's glory. This was another turning point in Moses' life, and it was at that moment that his life became significantly less about himself and significantly more about God. So what does Moses' meeting with God in the tent of meeting mean to us? Just like Moses gained confidence in God, we too can have a confidence in the fact that God is present in the current situations we face. When we are camping in the situations of life, God's presence is with us and we are not alone. We might feel alone in the sickness of death and a loved one, but we aren't alone. We might feel alone in our times of intense pain and grieving, but we aren't alone. We may feel alone when we lose a job or don't get that promotion, but we aren't alone. We may feel alone when the denomination of which we are a part makes a decision that doesn't seem right, that does not seem to line up with God's desire for us to love others despite their differences, but we aren't alone. We may feel alone when we are stressed, anxious, and burnt out, but we're not alone. God doesn't intend for you to do life alone. He wants to walk with you through each and every situation that you face. He wants to guide, to protect, and to bless you, just as he did with Moses. Just like Moses and the Israelites, you too can have a closeness to and a relationship with God. God's telling you today that he knows you by name. What an incredible God we serve.